Hello, and welcome to Anime Audio Commentary. Today I'll be commenting on Episode 3 of Cyberpunk Edgerunners. If you'd like to watch along, then start watching now. So, last we left off, it seemed like Lucy had really just sold David up the river. You know, it would seem as though the Sandevistan that he had installed on himself was meant for somebody else, but because his mom died, he didn't really know. And unfortunately for him, it seems like Lucy is in league with these people. So, that sort of throws the events of the previous episode into question, because it really seemed like she and David were kind of hitting it off, That whole bit with the brain dance on the moon, the way she was saying about how she never told anybody about her dream about going to the moon, that seemed sincere. So, if this was all a ruse, it certainly seems like it could be a ruse just to have lured David in and kept him in one place long enough for the rest of the gang to drop by. So fortunately, it seems like David's only saving grace here is the fact that his mom was the gang's supplier. Because, things definitely weren't going too well for David here, but the fact that he's related to Gloria and that she just sort of died suddenly and abruptly, it seems like if nothing else, these guys might be decent enough to, not kill a guy in these circumstances. Yeah, so I guess that's kind of par for the course. They might not be willing to just rip the Sandevistan out of him as things stand, but this doesn't put them on friendly terms. So, it's interesting in that these guys are cyberpunks, and it seems like that's sort of something David would be interested in doing. It's not exactly a career path you can just sort of hop into, but these are extreme, extenuating circumstances. It's almost refreshing to hear David say, come on, just give me a chance to, basically become a hired mercenary. I mean, looking at it objectively, the Sandevistan should make him somewhat valuable, especially considering how frequently he can use it. Maybe that was a poor choice of words on David's part, you know. How about I prove it to you in a sort of confrontational way? So it is interesting that he says, you know, I've used the Sandevistan 10 times today. You know, everybody just sort of takes that at face value. You know, that's something one would think people should scrutinize. And indeed, Lucy could back him up. So I guess, I don't know, they're sort of taking his demeanor as a bigger factor. I mean, he did just use the Sandevistan in front of them twice, and he certainly seems confident, so, you know, that might be worth a little bit of a chance, if not trust. I mean, indeed, it seems like they really don't trust him, but they are willing to see how things go. So naturally, if David's the new guy in the gang, he's probably going to be used as basically bait or something on that level, while the real trusted people take care of the actual job itself. So David's actually addressing the sort of big elephant in the room here. And it's not like anything really gets resolved, but, you know, he sort of touches on the idea that, like, you know, you really had no interest in me. You know, thanks, I guess. Yeah, well, David's gotten himself into something interesting now, you know. He's essentially joined up with a bunch of cyberpunks, so I can only imagine life will continue to get interesting. You know, there's always sort of something going on in Night City. Now, just to, I guess, put a bit of a fine point on things, you know, David's hooking up with these cyberpunks, and at the same time, he's being called by his principal to say, like, you know, if you apologize, we'll let you back into the academy. So, you know, it's kind of subtle, but this is basically showing that David has essentially two paths in life. You know, he could do what his mom wanted, go back to Arasaka Academy, and essentially become a corpo, or he could forego all of that and become a cyberpunk. And I guess the idea here is that there's pros and cons to both. Because in the world of cyberpunk, you know, there are a lot of cyberpunks who are big, famous, larger-than-life figures. You know, I know of a few just from a cursory reading through lore, but, you know, I'm not exactly an authority on the topic. And, you know, being a corpo isn't exactly easy either, but there are a couple of certain guarantees that come along with it, which being a cyberpunk doesn't offer. Nevertheless, for somebody like David, I feel like being a cyberpunk has a bit more glamour to it, for want of a better term. Because, you know, there's not necessarily a whole lot of luxury, but it's like a cool thing to do. So it seems like the job is a bit of a heist, you know. There's a guy who works at Arasaka. They know his routines and what he does for fun. The idea here is that they need to swipe some data from his car without stealing the car itself. And that makes sense, you know, if this guy's security at Arasaka, if they swipe the car, then, you know, Corpo private security is going to come down on them. So they need the information without making it really clear that they were there at all in the first place. So it seems like there's been extensive planning that's gone into this already. You know, they've basically fixed like an underground boxing match so as to ensure the Mark has a bad day so that he goes to drown his sorrows at the bar. So naturally, if he's going to a bar to drown his sorrows, he's going to get a little sloppy drunk. So, I'm sure a drunk guy is far easier to pickpocket than a sober guy. But it seems to me that the real trick here is ensuring that nobody knows anything has happened before things kick off. And I have to say, I'm interested to see that David's playing a bit of a pivotal role here by actually swiping the key. That's fairly foundational to the success of this plan. And considering how the guy's getting called by his boss, things are getting really complicated really quickly. Now, it's nice that we're finally seeing Rebecca show up. Rebecca's a good character. I like her a lot. I think she adds to the show. She's not in as much as I think anyone would like, but when she does show up, it's definitely appreciated. Now, I guess the interesting bit is that she's essentially serving as a distraction when, being familiar with this as I am, I know her talents lie elsewhere. Yeah, this is actually an interesting introduction to her, considering that she's rather even-tempered, That's definitely not the norm for her. Alright, so things are getting really sticky here. They're in the car, they've got the data, but now the guy's shooting at him. So, what can you do? Just sort of get out of the car and say, hey, this is a misunderstanding? Unfortunately, no. It seems like circumstances have conspired, forcing them to actually steal the car. And I guess in a weird sort of way, this is a test for David as well, Things are getting hairy, and he's the one in the driver's seat, so, doesn't matter that you don't know how to drive a car, you're learning right now. And this road test, you're basically playing for keeps. Yeah, so given that Maine was pretty clear that if they do steal the car, things are going to get sticky, it seems like things are really only going to get worse unless they manage to, really get the hell out of Dodge quickly with that car. Yeah, that's rather unfortunate, The only response to David's inquiry, do you think we're gonna make it, is, it's up to you, man. It's not exactly reassuring. And I guess even less reassuring is that an organized motorcycle gang has basically been sent to kill him and retrieve the car. So, I'm wondering if this has to do with sort of, Arasaka politics. They don't necessarily want to send, like a name brand hit squad, for want of a better term. They don't want to make this clear that Arasaka's saying, hey, you stole our car, now you die. They're just sending, people who will impart plausible deniability, it seems like. And that's kind of the name of the game with Cyberpunk here. There's a lot of subterfuge and intrigue, and while there's a whole lot of straightforward violence, it's not always by the groups you would think it would be. So, if I didn't like Cyberpunk Edgerunners as much as I did, I would say that this is a little bit silly. Because, I'm certainly not a great driver, but I know my car can't do that. And it's not like David is a pro driver himself, so... But that aside, I do think it's a pretty nifty scene, and it seems to me that Like, a lot of these cars are, like, actually 2D. You know, they're not like CG cars, which is, a bit of a deviation from how things seem to be done normally these days. You know, a lot of the time, cars in anime are CG and pretty ugly at that, although, if these cars are CG, they look, pretty darn good. Or at least good enough to, make it hard to tell at first glance. I mean, that's something that always sort of appeals to me, seeing, like, vehicles and mechanical objects drawn in 2D, because, you know, it's certainly a lot easier to represent them with, like, 3D software, but, like, I don't know, there's something about drawing it in 2D, like, you really have to have a sort of precision to your artwork to draw, like, actual mechanisms functioning, especially convincingly. I guess that's part of why I like mecha anime and stuff like that, especially when it shows like actual mechanisms and things like that operating. You know, pistons and actuators, stuff like that. So this is a nice little display of combat augmentations. You know, this motorcycle gang member here, he's got what I believe is called a mantis claw, and it's essentially like a spring-loaded blade that pops out of your forearm. It's a pretty nifty thing designed for close combat, and, you know, I believe they're usually designed to be, like, pretty darn razor sharp, so you can basically mince up anybody if you get them within arm's reach. I just think that was a nice display of, well, one, the thing working, and two, the fact that, rock beats scissors, as it were. You know, unfortunately, the motorcycle punk brought a knife to a gunfight. So now that all's said and done, you know, David managed to acquit himself pretty darn well. You know, it's interesting. Maine is sort of being friendlier to him now, and he's imparting wisdom, but that wisdom is, you know, you can't really trust anyone but yourself, which is sort of a repeated theme here in Night City, you know. Everybody's untrustworthy, you have to look out for yourself. That said, you know, it is nice to see everybody essentially just goofing around and having fun when things had been so serious earlier. And it also seems like things are looking kind of on an upward trend for David. You know, he got his payment for the jab, he got a bunch of immunoblockers, so he doesn't have to worry about basically dropping dead. And Maine's also giving him some more advice, you know. It wouldn't hurt to chrome up a little bit here and there. And I guess that's pretty sound advice, you know. More augmentations would make him stronger. And, you know, seeing as how David can take it, you know, why not? But even if things were in a bit of a good mood, you know, that can't last forever. You know, they did end up stealing the car when they shouldn't have, and it seems like the client has decided to show up and berate him. Now this guy, Faraday, is, I believe, what you call a fixer. And that's, in the tabletop game, another sort of character class. It's basically like a minor corpo who specializes in dealing with other cyberpunks, getting them jobs, gathering intel. More of a, I guess, an intelligence-based class, as it were. So, things are a bit interesting, because, you know, by stealing the car, it would seem as though Maine and company rendered the data they harvested useless. Faraday here seems to be gunning for Tanaka. Tanaka, the father of the kid David slugged. So it seems like there's a bit of an interconnected web here, and only Faraday really knows what's going on. And what's more, he definitely doesn't want to share information, The thinking is his job, and all the stupid peons shouldn't burden themselves with the details. On the one hand, it's kind of sound practice, seeing as how you really can't trust anybody in Night City, but on the other hand, if you want your peons to do the job properly, it helps to have them know what they're doing, essentially. Yeah, so unfortunately, Maine, disagreeable though he is sort of forced to kowtow to Faraday, seeing as how he's the one who ultimately pays the bills. I mean, sure, maybe they could find, somebody else to give them work, but there's no guarantees in Night City, and I imagine there's already a bit of a rapport between Maine's crew and Faraday. It's not like he really trusts them, but in as much as he does, he's willing to hire them out. Yeah, unfortunately, Rebecca kinda gets the short end of the stick here. She's definitely showing interest in David, but David unfortunately really only has eyes for Lucy. So, if the earlier events of this episode weren't clear as to whether or not David was actually going to become a cyberpunk, I think he's about to make it pretty clear to the principal here that he does not intend to return to school. There we go, David's made it pretty clear now. He's a cyberpunk, he's not gonna play games with Arasaka Academy. And Tanaka's kid, if he wants revenge, the gloves are off now. I think it's pretty clear that even though David did slug him across the room, that was on the sort of low end of what the Sandevistan is capable of, especially now that he has more experience using it. Alright, well that's it for this episode. If you've enjoyed it, then by all means, tune in for the next one. See you, Space Cowboy.